Museums and war are inherently linked. Western museums in particular are colonial institutions that were born from the conquest and plunder of other cultures. If you are a regular viewer of this channel, you have heard me sing this song before. The collections of the world's most recognizable museums in Paris, Berlin, London, and so on all have items in their collection that cost people their lives. Looting is a byproduct of conflict, and people love shiny, sparkly things, and the money that can be earned from selling said shiny, sparkly things. From a political leadership standpoint, sometimes the best way to put down a rebellion or attempt to erase a culture or political ideations that oppose your regime is to start with destroying material culture, the physical things that are easiest to burn and break away. For people who live during times of conflict, food, shelter, and survival are the primary concerns of people living day to day. Museums are understandably the last thing on their minds. But while many people are fighting or fleeing war zones, there are those who hide away the paintings, the statues, the crown jewels, burrowing them away so that they can be retrieved at a later point in time. This way, they do not fall into the hands of those who would seek to sell or destroy them. There are cultural heritage professionals who have, throughout history and right now, have fought and are fighting to preserve cultural and historical landmarks in times of conflict. Over the last few months, I have noticed that the news cycle has kind of abandoned the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This conflict has been ongoing since 2014, but the recent full-scale invasion of Ukraine was an unprecedented escalation. The invasion has stretched from days to weeks to months, and millions of Ukrainians have had to flee their homes. We discuss conflict and war and its effects on cultural heritage fairly often on this channel. The entire point of me sitting here, writing scripts, and doing research is to discuss museums and history with you. So let's talk about museums. In general, museums display material culture, and they often display and represent the culture of the nation that they are located in. Vladimir Putin does not see Ukraine as its own country. In Vladimir Putin's essay, Heirs of the Ancient Rus, he frequently uses the term Ruski Mir, or Russian world, which encapsulates the idea that Ukraine and Russia are united by their use of the Russian language, which is one of the many justifications Putin uses to claim a connection with post-Soviet states. He argues that Ukraine is a Soviet fiction, that the Ukrainian language is a Russian dialect, and that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. This ideology has put manifestations of Ukrainian independence directly in the crosshairs. There are many museums, theaters, religious sites, art galleries, and other cultural buildings in Ukraine. Strongholds that display the wealth of culture that belongs to this nation. The Ukrainian people know that Putin doesn't see them as their own culture, as their own nation. So there has been extra care to empty museums and art galleries since the invasion began. Museum professionals have risked life and limb and have spent precious time stowing away cultural artifacts so that they might be received in a more peaceful time. While Ukrainians are moving street signs and doing everything they can to confuse or slow the Russian invaders, they are also working to protect monuments and the parts of these cities that make them appear culturally Ukrainian. Statues and monuments have been reinforced with plywood, sandbags, plastic, and duct tape in an effort to protect them from the damage of the incessant shelling seen in parts of the country. There has been a significant amount of damage sustained by buildings and infrastructure in Ukraine, and cultural buildings have not been exempt from this. According to UNESCO, as of July 25th, there has been confirmed damage to the following: 73 religious sites, 13 museums, 33 historic buildings, 24 buildings dedicated to cultural activities, 17 monuments, and 8 libraries. The report, which I will link below, does not go into detail about how damaged these buildings and monuments are, but considering the before and after photos of the Ivankiev Museum, I am not feeling particularly hopeful about anything on this list. You know it's bad when there's an entire Wikipedia page dedicated just to the cultural heritage being destroyed during a conflict. It is important to note that it is believed that several of these buildings were intentionally fired on and not just caught in the crossfire. The Hry-Hory Skowroda Museum in Kharkiv region and the aforementioned Ivankiv Historical and Local History Museum in Kyiv region are both believed to have been intentionally targeted by rockets. Notable artworks and pieces from historical Ukrainian artists, including Maria Primachenko, have been reported as destroyed during some of these barrages. The Deputy Minister of Culture in Ukraine also noted that some museum collections, such as those in Mariupol and Melitopol, have been stolen by Russian invaders. Not that it means much for accountability while this conflict is ongoing, but it should be noted that the intentional destruction of cultural heritage is in fact a war crime. As a signatory of the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property, Russia is legally obligated to protect cultural heritage. Again, though, Putin does what he pleases. From his actions so far in Ukraine, it appears he does not care about any legal obligations, and he is more interested in proving himself right and proving that Ukraine is a part of Russia. If he destroys Ukrainian culture and cultural heritage, then he can prove to the world that Ukrainians were really just Russians all along. Right? Even before 2022, the Ukrainian diaspora was broad and far-reaching. You can find Ukrainian communities all over the world. The third largest population of Ukrainians outside of Russia and Ukraine is actually where I live, in Canada. According to the 2016 census, there were over 1 million Ukrainians living in Canada. With this conflict, I imagine this number has probably increased as Ukrainians are seeking refuge in other countries with friends and family. As there is such a large population of Ukrainians in Canada, there are actually several Ukrainian cultural museums across the country, and one of them, the Ukrainian Museum of Canada, is actually planning on repatriating items to Ukraine once this conflict is over, in an effort to bolster any collections that were destroyed through this conflict. If it wasn't apparent, museums and heritage professionals are not sitting idly by. As we have seen, they are risking life and limb to stow away material representations of Ukrainian life and culture. But they are doing more than just hiding away national treasures. There was a Twitter thread floating around that showed a certain artifact being pulled into the streets of Kyiv. In World War II, large spiked pieces of metal known as hedgehogs were pulled into the streets to slow the advance of tanks. In 2022, nearly a century after these hedgehogs first saw battle, they have been pulled from their museum displays and placed at crucial points around Kyiv, museum labels still attached. Another interesting thing being done by museums right now is the National Museum in Kyiv has actually curated an exhibit with items left behind by Russian forces. The exhibition, called Ukraine Crucifixion, features displays and installations made of everyday items such as boots and food jars, as well as weapons of war such as the shells of Russian missiles. One item that first struck me when I read about it was a diary left behind by one of the Russian invaders. According to a worker at this museum, Dmitry Haidentov, he said, "On the one hand, the soldier wrote that he was unsure that the invasion was right, that it was a good idea. But when we saw the information about the interrogation of civilians who were called the Nazis, in this part we can see the image of the invaders' army." Haidentov said that these artifacts will personify the army and help Ukrainians and other non-Russians understand that these soldiers are not just abstract enemies, but real people. On the other side of this conflict, though, we see museums being used for nefarious purposes. Not only are museums in Russia going to likely be depots for stolen cultural material, but they are also proving to be an effective tool for propaganda. Since the early days of the conflict, a museum in Moscow known as the Museum of the Great Patriotic War, or the Victory Museum with a Z, has been running an exhibition that traces the roots of a Ukrainian version of Nazism. As I mentioned, the Victory Museum recently changed their name so it includes the letter Z, and I just kind of wanted to bring it up in case you weren't aware that the letter Z has been used by Russian military in Ukraine and has been part of the pro-war propaganda campaign that has been spread since earlier this year. Throughout the last few months, Putin has frequently mentioned that Nazism is one of the main reasons behind his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the title of this exhibition kind of gets straight to that point, as it's called Ordinary Nazism. Let's read the exhibit description on the Victory Museum's website. More than 200 exhibits tell about the atrocities of Ukrainian nationalists during the Second World War, as well as about the mass crimes and terror of modern neo-Nazis against the inhabitants of Ukraine in 2014 to 2022. The exhibition materials will show the inextricable link between the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, which participated in the extermination of civilians during the war, and modern nationalist organizations in Ukraine that revived the ideology of Nazi Germany. The director of the Victory Museum, Alexander Shulnik, has been placed on a sanctions list in the United Kingdom and Australia for using his position as the head of a significant national cultural institution to spread disinformation. This conflict, unfortunately, is not going to be ending anytime soon, and I'm afraid to say that I believe that their list of damaged cultural sites and stolen artifacts is just going to get longer and longer. With that being said, the outpouring of support for Ukraine from the rest of the world, especially as far as its cultural heritage is concerned, is, I think, the one kind of sign of hope that we can take away from this. I have hope for the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian culture. I believe that they are a stubborn folk and that they will outlast and survive anything that Putin can throw at them. But they shouldn't have to deal with this. And I don't really have a good note to end this video on except for fuck Vladimir Putin and his warmongering. If you have reached the end of this video, I hope that you are safe, and I hope that you have a lovely day/evening, and I will see you next time.
Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми тую червону калину